everyone. Thank you so much for attending the inaugural event of the Culture and Contemporary Life series. This series is an initiative of the Culture section of the American Sociological Association. And the purpose of the series is to explore the pressing social issues of our time through a cultural lens and examine how cultural sociology can inform these issues. So we'll be having panels throughout the year, and please stay tuned for those. Each panel will be a discussion guided by a moderator and will feature several scholars who are experts in the area. And the discussion will be followed by a Q&A. This session is, of course, on the 2020 election, a cultural post-mortem. And to participate in the Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A at any time during or after the discussion. So I'll now hand the floor over to Ruth Braunstein, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, to introduce the speakers and kick off the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah, and to the committee for organizing this panel. And thanks also to the chair of the culture section, Terry McDonald, for inaugurating this great series of events. I'm really excited to be here with some really exciting experts to talk about the election and sort of the ongoing events related to that this year. We have with us Mabel Berezin, who is a professor of sociology at Cornell University and is the author of, among many things, the book Making the Fascist Self, The Political Culture of Interwar Italy and Illiberal Politics in Neoliberal Times, Culture, Society, and Populism in the New Europe. We also have Bart Bonikowski, who's an associate professor of sociology at New York University and is currently completing a book manuscript building on a number of his previous articles and writings called Radicalized: How the Right Has Mobilized Nationalism and Undermined Liberal Democracy. And third, we have Corey Fields, an associate professor and Idle Family Term Chair in sociology at Georgetown University, who's the author of Black Elephants in the Room, The Unexpected Politics of African American Republicans. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with all of you today. So we are going to have about 45 minutes of a moderated discussion about a variety of topics, and then we'll open it up, as Hannah said, to Q&A for about 15 minutes. And if you do have questions, please submit those. And the panelists will have the opportunity to answer a handful of those at the end of our time today. So I just wanted to start out by asking you, who are, sort of experts on a number of these things, about the fact that we all know the Trump presidency has brought a number of new terms into the mainstream American political lexicon. These have often been common terms in other political contexts and are maybe newer here or are newer to mainstream politics here. Things like fascism, authoritarianism, nationalism, including white nationalism or white Christian nationalism, populism, and a number of other terms. Some argue that these terms are alarmist or divisive, and that Trump is really just a regular Republican with a more dramatic and less constrained mode of self-presentation. Others argue that these terms are necessary and add needed clarity and urgency to a political discourse that has been too inclined to normalize Trump. What role do you think these terms play politically and analytically? Are they productive? How? And I'll go alphabetically here. And so I'll start with you, Mabel. Oh, and turn off your mute.
Unmute. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me to participate in the inaugural conversation, as it were. And I have to just begin with an anecdote. Around 2017, I wrote to my publisher at Cornell University Press, and as you all know, old books like Making the Fascist Self are now on some kind of digital kind of thing so they can be reproduced really quickly. And I wrote to him and I said, maybe this is a good time to sort of put out again a book called Making the Fascist Self with a new introduction, and we could talk a little bit about, what's going on in the United States. And he wrote me back and he said, that he talked to the marketing department and he said, there's just no interest in the term fascism under any circumstances. So aside from the fact that I'm kind of weeping about that, the issue is, I have to say, although I wanted to do another edition, at least an edition with a new intro, I myself, as a student of fascism, was very much taken by surprise that this has suddenly become the word du jour. And the interest in fascism, it seems to have accelerated, particularly it seems to me after 2019. When I did my annual review piece a year ago, we actually did a run on terms, populism, communism, and nationalism. And fascism was just starting to go up in the public sphere, but nowhere near as it's gone in, I'd say, the past year or so. So that you get intellectual articles in New York Review, you get arguments among historians, you get politicians like AOC arguing at the beginning of in October, saying we're in a fascist moment. She actually said this is fascism at our door, talking about Trump. So there's been this sort of renaissance, as it were, not a good renaissance, but of the term fascism. So it does exactly come to Ruth's point, and one does have to ask, what exactly, what analytic purchase do we actually get from the reinvigoration of this term? And also, not only what analytic purchase, but are there any pragmatic dimensions politically pragmatic dimensions to using it? From an analytic point, this has always been my position, that it's basically a historically specific term. It's not that precise when looking at what's going on, even from country to country in Europe. And it's certainly not that precise when talking about the United States. And that, in fact, if you go back to the original fascism, you really, and you sort of look at it and try to think about the United States today, that despite the kind of images that we have of fascism, and fascism is a term that gets into popular culture as well as academic discourse and political discourse, the so-called fascism, by the way, fascism, the term was actually coined by Mussolini and a political philosopher named Giovanni Gentile in Italy. But basically what these people had in mind was a very comprehensive vision of society in which every part basically fits. So it's nothing like what's going on in the United States. And it's also it's a term that has tended to become what, in many ways, what my colleague Jeffrey Alexander has called a bridging metaphor when he was talking about the Holocaust. In other words, it becomes a term for everything we don't particularly like or is evil. So I could say more about that, but I want to move on. I don't want to give a lecture on fascism, and I want other people to speak. But I think my short point is that I don't think it has as much analytic purchase as we would want, and I think there are other more careful historical and
So I think that we maybe lost Mabel there right at the end. If you are able to hear me, maybe you can chime back in with your concluding point, and we'll maybe move to Bart next, and we can come back around to Mabel at the end here.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks again for the invitation. It's a terrific initiative. So I'm going to bracket fascism because Mabel spoke very eloquently about that, and I share her view that it's a useful term for some, but it's imprecise, and it leads to overly simplistic, I think, historical parallels. So if one wants to learn about fascism and its application to today's politics, I think the work of Federico Finkelstein. The work of Federico Finkelstein, Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley is really good. But I want to talk about three other concepts in this plethora of labels that we've been using for contemporary politics. And those concepts are nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism. And I think these three terms are particularly useful for trying to understand the rise of radical right politics today in the United States and across a wide range of cases. I think of these three, populism is perhaps the most frequently misunderstood and erroneously applied to the whole totality of radical right politics. But nonetheless, these three concepts, nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism, I found especially useful when trying to understand radical right politics, sort of broad theoretical understanding of radical right politics that is comparative and that emphasizes political mobilization with reference to both the supply and demand sides of politics. So very briefly, when I say nationalism, what I mean by that are competing understandings of what the nation means. And these competing understandings constitute latent cleavages in national populations that can be mobilized, politically mobilized in particular historical circumstances. That's one concept. Populism, I think, is something very specific, and it often is pitched too broadly. That is a mode of political claims making that is predicated on this moral opposition between a vilified, corrupt elite of some sort and a glorified people. It's not an attribute of parties or candidates, but rather of their claims. And it is not inherently right-wing or left-wing. It's quite malleable politically. So that's populism. And the third one is authoritarianism, which is really, in my view, a mode of political governance. It's a way of governing that violates democratic norms and liberal rights protections. So these are three separate constructs that, in my work, I've argued, constitute the fundamental building blocks of radical right politics, of which Trump and the current Republican Party is one instantiation. I want to make one point. These three concepts are not equal in terms of their cultural potency, right? Of these three concepts, only nationalism is really a source of deep identity commitments that are legitimized through dominant institutions. And that's why I've argued that nationalism, and ethno-nationalism in particular, is absolutely central for understanding the rise of radical politics and its mainstreaming in recent years. And sort of if I were to put it in a nutshell, I would say that these nationalist cleavages around different understandings of nationhood within countries are the fuel for the rise of radical politics. Populism stokes the fire, and then what results is really the tolerance for authoritarian rule. These three types of political culture have been leveraged as claims by elites, but they also exist in popular beliefs. And it's really, the question really becomes, why are they resonating in new ways today when they've been around for a long time? And I think in a nutshell, the answer is that the current historical moment has enabled elites, political elites, to opportunistically seize on a wide range of anxieties associated with economic, demographic, and cultural changes, and essentially turn them and channel them into out-group resentments. How did this happen? It's essentially about linking a whole bunch of deep fears among, typically in the U.S. case and Europe, white majorities, and blaming somebody for the problems that these fears flag. What that effectively does is it essentially aggravates a sense of collective status threat among racial, religious majorities. And when that happens, these nationalist cleavages become manifest, mobilizable, and they lead to support for radical politicians like Trump and for the current GOP. So I think this is sort of why we are where we are today. And the result is that all of a sudden authoritarian politics become the rule of the day. And that opens the door to the breakdown of liberal democracy. So I think in that sense, sort of honing in on these three elements is really important because they have very specific causes, they are combined in particular ways, and they have distinct consequences for political culture and for the stability of democratic institutions. One last thing about this, I think the terms that I've mentioned, nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, are especially important if we're going to think about radical politics comparatively. That is to sort of take into account what is uniformly found across a wide variety of cases and bracket idiosyncratic features of individual country cases. And so I think it's really profitable to think about ethno-nationalism as these nationalist cleavages. They're activated not just in the United States, but across European countries and beyond, actually, right? If you think about India, it's really Hindu nationalism that is being mobilized in the pursuit of authoritarian politics, right? So it's about creating a sense of fear and anxiety among majorities, turning that into resentment, and then mobilizing those sentiments for political gain and for authoritarian control of democratic institutions. We can talk about what this means for the future of U.S. democracy, but I'll stop at that and come back to that later.
Cool. Okay, so I guess I go now. All right, cool. Well, first off, as the previous panelist said, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to actually talk about a lot of these issues with the other folks on this panel, and I'll keep my commentary on this question particularly brief because you've heard from the in-house experts on things like federalism, nationalism, and populism. But what struck me, I guess, well, thinking about the sort of political efficacy of those terms is actually, I think in some ways, the vagueness of them is partly what makes them very politically useful. And what I've been most struck by was the sort of oppositional use of fascism, right? So it's sort of like it's this effective mobilizer on the left, and thinking through, it's a get people into the streets kind of language. And because in some ways, a lot of the underlying principles, certainly around, this sort of demonization of outgroups, certainly racial and ethnic outgroups by white people, is nothing new, certainly not to non-white people, right? So this notion of, Christian white nationalism doesn't strike any Black people I know as a surprising concept. And I don't think it really strikes many white people as a surprising thing, right? But I do think the sort of deployment of language around like fascism, particularly, serves as this sort of politically useful mobilizing force on the left. Now, the sort of analytic accuracy of that seems like it's an open question. I mean, it seems pretty clear that, AOC isn't super concerned about technically, is Trump a fascist, right? And that might be sort of a fanciful goal, is to try to hold people to proper definitions of things, or certainly academic definitions of things. But from an analytic standpoint, I think for us as scholars, it's certainly useful to attend to that and to make sense of it. And I was really struck by what Bart was just saying, this idea of like, in particular around this notion of populism, because one of the striking things about Trump it has been the way he's managed to sort of if you think about populism as this sort of Zamalian social form, right? That Trump has managed to take that social form and fill it with new content, because like the Tea Party people were sort of populist, but their outgroup elites were like sort of financial elites and big corporations and Barack Obama, right? Because underlying all of it probably was some level of racism, which partly helps us understand how Trump was able to convert fill populism with new content of sort of, it's not about free markets are the answer to everything. Instead, it's about America first, right? And so this sort of ability to take that form and pour new content into it, I think is sort of a fascinating analytical a question, but I think I totally agree with Bart, the idea that the notion that, these forms cross time and place absolutely makes a lot of sense. I think in some ways, for me, what's been most striking is to think about the history of the U.S., right, in a sort of comparative way, right? It's sort of like we've been grappling with a lot of these problems. Certainly, certain Americans have been grappling with them time immemorial, right? But we're sort of applying new language to them. And so in some ways, the extent to which this is becoming something we all have to talk about has been one of the striking things about, the sort of Trumpist moment.
Great, thanks for that, Corey. And I wanted to come back to Mabel, as I mentioned, just to see if you wanted to, remake your last little final point about fascism before we move on here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can people hear me? Okay. I just want to be quick. I mean, it's absolutely true. I didn't mean to suggest that AOC is actually trying to be an expert on fascism. And I mean, I think there are two things going on. There's what I call the popular mobilization dimension of it. And then there's also the historical, and maybe on the historical side here, aside from the past, as it were, it'd be interesting to do a comparative historical account of why intellectuals at this moment have taken this up. But I do agree it's a mobilizing thing. But the last point I just want to make is that I don't actually think it's all that useful, although we have learned a lot in the Trump administration about how far you can push the boundaries of democracy and the things you can do. I don't think that terms like this, they do have emotional generative effects, and everybody wants to go fight fascists. But in point of fact, I think our lesson is something a little bit more troubling, and I'm sure we'll go on to that as the rest of the discussion goes on, because he did push the boundaries pretty far. So.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I think that, in some ways this now kind of brings us up to date to our current question, which has to do with the election. And the election took place against this context where at least some people, particularly people on the left, but also, scholars who study politics and journalists were openly using, terms like fascist, terms like authoritarian, to describe the sitting president of the United States. And then we come to an election and, large numbers of people voted for another 4 years of Donald Trump, knowing exactly who he is in the context of, what many people view as a botched response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and knowing that he has pushed all of these boundaries in terms of democratic norms beyond just the policies that he's pursuing. And so there's been obviously a lot of sort of soul searching and early analysis of who those voters were, right? This sort of question of who is it that voted for Trump. And I do think that, one of the things that we could talk about is that, more than 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, in part because so many people voted this time around because of the sort of changes that were made to how elections are run in this country, in terms of ease of voting by mail, longer periods of time to vote. But nonetheless, in terms of the share of the vote that Donald Trump won, it does raise questions, and it didn't sort of offer what many people hoped to be this repudiation of Donald Trump, his policies, and his style. And so I think that there's some questions that get raised by this. One is, of course, this question of, did everybody who vote for Trump, is everyone a white nationalist? Like, is this something that now much larger numbers of Americans are comfortable with than previously thought? We also, though, know that it's possible that he made inroads with voters of color, Blacks and Hispanics in certain districts that were important, blocks of voters that made a difference. And so I just want to ask, what sort of is your take on who Trump voters were in 2020, and how we can reconcile these different narratives about who supported him? And just to mix things up, I'm going to start with Corey, and we can then go in a different order.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that, but I think I could be ready. Good mixing up. I think for me, right, so I guess I'll out the gate say it seems super early to make any hard empirical claims about who voted for whom and sort of like what's happening trend-wise. Like, to be honest, we're just now starting to have a good data-based understanding of what happened in 2016. So I am very skeptical of sort of using exit polls to make big claims about massive voter shifts, right? But I mean, it's probably fair to say, if you look at some of the county level data, so you can look at sort of the demographics of counties and see how those counties went, and I guess sort of make some claim, I guess initial claims. And certainly, there were, have seen accounts of how, Latino, had some heavily Latino counties that had previously been going Democrat, sort of went Republican this cycle. And there's sort of, loose talk around like Trump getting, over 10, 12% of the Black vote, which, to be fair, on the Black vote standpoint, that's just sort of what Republicans normally get when Barack Obama isn't running. So I haven't been particularly impressed by, the sort of Black vote numbers for Trump. And I wouldn't, make too much of that. The other point I feel like that is some ways, for me, the overarching story was the sort of intensity of partisanship, right? So you say, like, why do 70 million people vote for Donald Trump? Are they all white nationalists? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know 70 million people. And so I can't discern who's a white nationalist and who isn't. But certainly, it seems like, people are voting because they identify themselves as Republican, and the Republican who was running was Donald Trump. So Donald Trump got their vote. I mean, I personally think you could probably dress up two adorable pugs, one in a red shirt, one in a blue shirt, and be like, the red shirt's the Republican, the blue shirt's the Democrat, and each pug would claim 60 million votes just because people are like, oh, well, my guy is the blue pug, so that's who I'm going to vote for. So I think there was a fair amount of sort of partisan voting where you're sort of like, I vote for this guy because I'm a Republican. And it's sort of, and I do think there has been a sort of imbalance in the salience of that partisanship. I think Republican partisanship has become a lot more central in terms of meaning and importance in the life of Republicans, whereas for Democrats, like, I don't think there's been a parallel thing that's happened with Democratic as this sort of political identity that's important and meaningful for people. And, you know, I think if I were someone involved in sort of projections around Democratic politics, that would concern me seriously, because like right now, I think increasingly the left is becoming cobbling together coalitions in a way that leaves them sort of unlinked around this bigger identity of like, this is us, this is what we believe in. But I do think on the right, that's sort of, it's congealed around Trump, but I suspect it's going to hang post-Trump, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm a Republican, and so I'm going to vote for the Republican and sort of support what the Republicans support. And, you know, the extent to which, you know, there's a sort of a tighter Republican operation that moves into place after Trump, I actually think there'll be a fairly likely transference of support, right? I know there's a lot of like, you know, the Republicans don't want to upset the Trump supporters, blah, 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 but it seems like the extent to which Republicans have done a good job of mobilizing partisan identity as a meaningful identity, that's something that says a lot about you and who you are among their partisans, that's going to pay out long term, like well beyond this election. So I'll stop there so other people can talk.
Great, thanks, Corey. And so Mabel, next. Mute.
Okay, this is something that really has been sort of bothering me since the last election, and as things have been coming, things certainly came out, and although I agree with Corey, there's a lot we don't know, and but there has been a kind of narrative that I think is pretty common, that there are these people that have somehow gotten sort of forgotten by time and place, and they are sort of in their ruthlessness, basically, and their poverty and their lost employment, they basically have been attracted to Donald Trump, and there have been a lot of empirical research that has had that narrative. One of the things that bothers me in that narrative is I think it's very hard to imagine that all 74 million people are crazed white nationalists. I am sure that some of them really are, and I'm sure that Trump's rhetoric has resonated with a lot of those people, and I'm sure that that is a trend. I mean, because you can look historically and see that that's a trend in American politics and, unfortunately, society. However, what I would really like to know, and I'd love for somebody to go out and do research on this in the coming 4 years, is 74 million people voted for Trump. Who are those people that are sort of maybe the 40 million or the 35 million, I don't want to put a number on it, who just voted for Trump for reasons that we're not imagining? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with how you ask the questions, the kind of research you do. And, you know, I don't want this to be late-breaking sociology, but just this morning I was reading an article in Politico, and as most of you know, New York City is a traditionally traditionally Democratic area. And there are a few neighborhoods that voted basically Republican. And where are they? Well, Staten Island, for those of you who don't realize, is a part of New York City, and Staten Island is traditionally Republican. Another part of South Brooklyn, which has sort of recently been a sort of closed, sort of white ethnic neighborhood, which is suddenly becoming more multicultural. And the Midwood section of Brooklyn, which is basically is a Hasidic Jewish community, essentially. And the political reporter went in and said something like, you know, why'd you vote for Donald Trump? And what they didn't say, like, because they talked about Bill de Blasio, and they said Bill de Blasio was closing down all the synagogues, and so was Cuomo and things like that. But what the woman they interviewed said, of course, she wouldn't give her name because it's fear, but she said basically because this is like Nazi Germany, this is the Holocaust coming back, in the sense that you know, that they're closing down the place of worship. I'm guessing that would not be the answer probably many of us would think of as sociologists as to why these people are voting that way. I'm guessing there are stories out there that we haven't thought about, not only in sort of the Republican swaths of Kings County, but across the country. And I think that some of those stories we have to figure out a way to sort of tap into and find out what that's all about. I mean, when we think about millionaires and billionaires, a la Bernie Sanders, we think of the Goldman Sachs crew. But there are a lot of people who make a lot of money who are not Goldman Sachs folks, who maybe just don't want regulations. And they really like the fact that Trump has gotten rid of, if there's anything to Trumpism, he's gotten rid of all kinds of regulations. So my main point here is that in terms of the meaning of voting for Trump, and we are cultural sociologists, is that there are stories out there. I don't know what they are, but we have to figure out a way, I think, to sort of tap into them. And it will tell us a little bit more of what kinds of strategies to employ if I were a Democratic political operative going forward and wanting and sort of changing the landscape that the polarized landscape that we appear to be looking at.
Great, Ruth, I guess I'm next, right? So just to start with something that you asked about toward the end of your question, has nationalism or authoritarianism increased in its prevalence in the U.S. population? Is this why we're getting the current politics? The answer to that is absolutely not. The U.S. is not becoming more racist, more xenophobic, more ethno-nationalist in terms of the aggregate population. And I've done some research on this with Yuval Feinstein, with Sean Bach, previous work with Paul DiMaggio. In the aggregate, the trends are either stable or the country is becoming more inclusive. But what has happened in the last 20 years is a massive sorting of nationalist beliefs by party, which has effectively made the Republican Party into an ethno-nationalist authoritarian party. And that is a huge problem. This is why we saw what happened in 2016 and in 2020, and this is at the core of the problems for U.S. democracy going forward. So I'll come back to that. But the other question about who are Trump voters in 2020, I think the short answer beyond just broad generalizations is that we don't know. As Corey was saying, most of the breakdowns that we see today are based on exit polls, which are notoriously unreliable, especially in a year where there's a lot of mail-in voting. Or it's based on aggregate data that are prone to to various ecological fallacies. So one should be very careful about these minute breakdowns of Trump voters. There's some evidence of erosion of Trump support in the suburbs, continued shift among white working class voters toward Trump. And then there is this evidence of small gains among Latinos and African Americans on the order of 4 or 5 points that Corey was talking about. But I think these minutiae distract us from the bigger story. And the bigger story is Trump was elected in 2016 by white Americans, period, right? Not white working class, white Americans, right? The majority of white Americans voted for Trump in 2016, same in 2020. In 2016, Black and Latino voters overwhelmingly rejected Trump, and they did so again in 2020, arguably ensuring that U.S. democracy lives to see another day. Right? So that is the big pattern that I think is really important. Now, we can come back to why there were these 4-point swings or 5-point swings among Latinos in very specific places and African Americans as well. But again, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, these are cities where African American voters are represented. They saved the Republic in 2020. So that's an important baseline to start with. Now, in terms of Trump supporters in particular, are they all racist? Are they all ethno-nationalists? Not overtly so, of course, right? There are many reasons for any given political outcome. For some single-issue voters, this is about abortion. For others, it's about taxation, right? And a whole bunch of other issues that people care about. But whatever the overt motivations of voters might be, a vote for Trump, I would argue, means that either you explicitly endorse his ethno-nationalism, right? Or that you're willing to give it a pass because it just doesn't apply to you, right? And so that is an important thing to keep in mind. It also means that you either don't care about liberal democratic institutions or you don't care much either way, whichever way they go, because their erosion will not affect you primarily and deeply, right? And so this is why I think that although the argument that Corey brought up, Republicans vote Republican, Democrats vote Democrat, I think that's true. Absolutely true, and we know that. We've known that for many, many years, particularly in the climate of greater polarization and effective polarization and otherwise. But I think this to some degree ignores the fact that Republicans didn't vote just for any Republican. right? They voted for a racist, xenophobic, authoritarian demagogue. And so either his ideas appealed to them or had little bearing on them. That's sort of the argument I would make. Now, on the issue of minority support for Trump, so again, that baseline of, again, Latinos and African Americans saving the republic, an important baseline. I think it's not all that sociologically surprising that we do see some support for Trump among these groups, right? I think it shows us, again, reminds us, if anything, that ethno-racial groups are not homogenous, and that we should be very cautious in essentializing their political beliefs, during elections or in general. The swing toward Trump came from very specific groups, if the swing is real, right? Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans in Florida, Tejanos along the U.S.-Mexican border, right? And these are very specific populations, right? So for instance, in Florida, Trump did a lot of outreach there and a lot of fear-mongering about becoming socialism of the Democratic Party. That seems to have worked. For some working class Latinos and African Americans, Trump's trade policies were appealing, or his COVID-related economic relief policies as well, right? There are a lot of people in these categories who are socially and culturally conservative and religious. And finally, I think it's important that we realize that ethno-nationalism is not totally limited to white Americans, although it's vastly overrepresented among them. In a paper that Paul DiMaggio and I wrote back in 2016, we show that actually restrictive and ardent nationalism, two varieties of ethno-nationalism, are overrepresented among African Americans and Latinos as well. And that's not that surprising if you think about the fact that these are bases of claims to belonging in the nation. That ancestry matters, that long-term residence matters, that being here for generations matters. If the Latino numbers are true, the 4-point swing is primarily among third-generation Latinos or Tejanos who didn't cross the border, but rather the border crossed them, right? So I think there's something slightly patronizing about him assuming that non-whites cannot adhere to exclusionary conceptions of identity. But again, to the degree that happens, it's among small minorities of minority groups. Right? Don't forget, 79% of black men voted for Biden, 90% of black women voted for Biden. Among Latinos, it's 59 and 69% respectively. Again, African American Latinos are not the problem. The majority of whites are the problem. If you think about the white voter turnout for Trump, 62% of white men, period, voted for Trump. They think he represents them. I think that we shouldn't focus too much on these small swings among particular minority groups. But the fact that the Republican Party has effectively become a party of ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism is cause for great concern. That will be with us for, these problems will be with us for many years to come, not just 2020.
Bart, I had a quick question. I'm sorry. Just sort of following up on that. I mean, for you, do you think the sort of brazenness or transparency of all this with Trump makes a difference? Because there are certainly people who would argue that, to sort of position Trump as being radically different from the presidents that preceded him in terms of the things he wanted to do and sort of like the people who voted for him and sort of at some level what they were about, is essentially like sort of, in some ways a sort of elite thing of like, this is just sort of dancing around, like it's like you want it decorated in like, appropriate, polite interaction, but the same outcomes is sort of what you want. And the Trump problem is like, oh, he's just saying it, right? Or like it's sort of been stripped bare. And so I guess, so is it, do we think it's like does he represent something different? Or is that break actually really meaningful? That like actually keeping it DL is kind of important, even though it's voting for the exact same things and policies, but calling it something else matters, right? Or is it just like, no, Trump is doing something different? And like, yeah, I guess that's just a quick question. Sorry.
I don't want to mobilize airtime, but I would say he was a catalyst and an accelerator, right? These are the pattern of partisan sorting of nationalism that I pointed out started in the early 2000s, way before him. The demand among Republicans for this kind of politics has been around for a long time, which is why we saw the Tea Party, as you pointed out, which is why we saw Sarah Palin as a candidate. And Trump was just very capable at articulating these grievances and combining nationalist, populist, and authoritarian claims in a very skillful way. So I think he capitalized on a long-standing trend. And as you point out, the Republican Party has been doing authoritarianism in various shapes or forms, ethno-nationalist authoritarianism for a long time. But there is an aspect to Trump's blatant evocation of these claims and these narratives that itself, I think, has had an impact. So, the paper by Hal Kim and Zuckerman, called the authentic appeal of the lying demagogue, shows that people love his lies, and they know he's lying, but they love the lies because they are a testament to the fact that he represents them and is willing to be a system breaker and stick it to the man, right? And so there is a certain, I think, there are implications to his brazenness, net of the fact that he's also channeling pre-existing trends, and essentially, I mean, what he's done, I would say, is he's completed what's been in the works for a long time, which is the takeover, the capture of the Republican Party by its authoritarian ethno-nationalist wing. Right, but he's been aided and abetted by McConnell, and McConnell's strategy precedes Trump, and now with the current crisis of the last, since the election, the denial of Biden's victory by the Republican Party, they're just, the Republican Party is becoming very honest about its authoritarianism and its ethno-nationalism. So I imagine we'll see a lot more of it in the future.
Can I just add a word here? I went offline when Ruth was laying out her questions, but I mean, I generally agree with all Bart's position. He knows, but in this particular, people bought into it. That's sure.
I'm losing you a little bit, Mabel. Can you hear us? So in our couple minutes here before we move to Q&A, Mabel will have another chance to address this in a moment. Are you back?
Okay, fine. I want to know who they are. That's all. More.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we have a question that's going to get at that. So I'm going to come back to that question. Just in the 2 minutes here before we go, I'm going to do kind of a lightning round. So we're all reading the paper every day, making sure that, things are going according to plan with the transfer of power to President-elect Joe Biden. And there's kind of two ways that people are looking at this. And one is kind of a half glass full kind of analysis that the institutions of democracy are holding, the courts, the local electoral processes are holding, and that Joe Biden, who got the majority of votes, will become the next president of the United States, the majority of the electoral votes. And then there's a glass half empty interpretation of this, which is that the fact that Trump and majorities of Republicans are continuing to question the sort of election results and to pursue legal processes that are widely dismissed as illegitimate in order to overturn the election is leading to sort of potentially widespread loss of faith in democratic institutions. So should we be glass half full or glass half empty on this question? Or both? Provocative sort of.
Who goes first?
Two choice here.
Who wants to? Bart.
Yeah, let's start with Bart.
Can we have two glasses?
Half full.
You can do what academics do and question the premise. Yeah.
That's right. I think we need to have two glasses. I think the paranoia on the left about the 2020 election is misplaced, has been misplaced. As of about 4 a.m. on the night of election day, it was pretty clear that Biden would win. And from very early on, it was pretty clear that there was no legal path for Trump to steal the election. The 2020 election, as far as most legal scholars are concerned, is safe. But that, of course, does not mean that we shouldn't be extremely alarmed about what the current situation reveals about potential future forms of democratic erosion, right? So I don't think we're witnessing a coup. I think all of that paranoia is actually dangerous because it mainstreams the possibility of stealing an election. It's also typical of Democrats to hand wring and be very concerned about a victory they just achieved. But I think the coup aside, we are witnessing democratic backsliding. And as we know from the literature in political science, democracies don't die by a single coup typically, but rather by 1,000 cuts, usually legal cuts, right? And so I think what's going on right now is going to delegitimize Biden's presidency. And I think had Biden's margin not been so large, things might have gone differently, right? So all of these attempts at stealing the election may have worked. So the fact that Biden-Harris won by a big margin was essentially prevented the theft of the election. I think there's also some evidence that courts are shifting in their approach to voting rights and giving a lot more control over voting rights to states. And that invites all kinds of further disenfranchisement in future years. I think also, as we were just talking about, the GOP has again revealed itself to be an authoritarian party that, it's been pursuing voter disenfranchisement for a long time, and it's willing to continue doing so. And I think the bottom line is that the GOP cannot win without minoritarian bias in our institutions. It's about the Electoral College. It's about disenfranchisement of voters, the Senate and the Supreme Court, right? These are institutions and policies that ensure that a party that only represents a minority of voters is going to continue holding on to power and winning elections in the future. And as long as these institutions are in place as they look today, the white minority of voters will continue imposing its will on the multiracial majority, and democracy will suffer. So I think what this current moment reveals is a critical danger to U.S. democracy, even if 2020 itself is safe.
Okay, so we have a short amount of time before we go to Q&A. What are your thoughts, Corey and Mabel?
I guess I would say, I don't know. I would look at it and be like, oh.
I said,
I guess I would just say like, oh, there's the glass. Half of it is filled with water. I don't know what to make of that. Because I think in some ways, the things that we're talking about collectively as a nation, subpopulations of this nation have been experiencing, like voter suppression, disenfranchisement, the fragility of democracy, the fragility of access to political institutions, right? And so, I guess my only hope is that, now that this is starting to affect, or impact people who aren't Black and brown or Asian, like we can have like, oh, well, maybe we should do something about this shit, right? Well, hopefully maybe now we will, right? So I guess in some ways, I don't know. I mean, I don't read it as though there's some great erosion of what the U.S. had. I think in some ways there might have been a great exposure of the limitations of what the U.S. has always been trying to do, right, in terms of its democratic ideals. And we see that, these things fundamentally rest on reproduction through action and doing, right? Like America isn't democratic just because it's America. It is because we practice it. And so to the extent that we can use this moment to further entrench those practices across the country, across all populations, I think hopefully that's what happens out of this. Mabel, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, can anybody hear me? I don't see.
Maybe.
Oh, you hear me? Okay, because my yellow thing isn't coming up. Okay, I mean, I more or less sort of tend towards Corey's interpretation here. And I said before half full. I thought you wanted a one-word answer. But anyway,
sure.
The end of democracy. A lot of people. All right, I'm not sure the end of democracy literature is totally. That's why you need two glasses in a way. No, the extent of the damage this has done. And if the scenario is going to play out the way Bart has sort of fears it playing out, or the sort of more, dare I say, sanguine sort of approach of it.
So Mabel, I've unfortunately I've lost you a little bit here. Did you hear?
So I was half full, but it could have. Yeah, I'm sorry. My connection is apparently terrible, so please.
No worries. So we're going to move to some Q&A. We've gotten some great questions, and I'm going to actually just read a couple of them and ask individually each of you to answer them pretty quickly to see if we can get through one or two of them in the next 10 minutes. And so one of our questions from Anna Skarpelas has asked that all of the panelists have pointed to a core issue being a lack of understanding of who Trump voters are and what they believe in, particularly so early. What do you guys think are essentially the best methods that we can be using to understand, what Mabel called the stories that are out there and help to, capture some of this complexity that we've talked about? And I'm going to direct that at Mabel, who brought up this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we definitely need, this is definitely a qualitative kind of method. We need to talk to people, and we need to listen to them, and we need there were many, about 10 or 15, supposed to be careful of projecting ourselves into what we were, asking people about. And I think that that's something we have to be careful of when we sort of think about who these Trump voters, who these, let's just say the non-rabid nationalist Trump voters might be, what their reasons might be. And I'm guessing that there is a variety of, Bart said that there were
Mabel, if you turn off your video, the audio may come through a little more clear.
White nationalism, because it's not, there's a whole sort of mentality out there, I think, that we probably haven't really thought about enough or excavated enough, in part because of how we're listening to people. And maybe we need conversation rather than questions, not conversations of, I want to get about other things that takes, because a lot of this stuff comes up when people, if you ask them directly, they don't want to say, but if you just talk, you might find somebody. I don't know what that method would be, but at any rate, I think that's what we need.
Great. And I think that, I think all of the methods that are representative among our panelists here, I think, speak to the variety of different ways that we can get at some of this, and that sort of everyone is able to contribute a different piece of this puzzle, and that hopefully if there are others on the call who have other ideas, it's sort of all hands on deck trying to figure this out right now. Paul Lichterman.
Can I say one thing about that? Just one quick thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's actually true that we don't know why people are voting for Trump. I think by now there is just such a mountain of evidence, not just from the U.S. and Trump, but from across contemporary cases of radical right politics, and it's a pretty clear pattern, right? So I think, and the research is both qualitative and quantitative. We've got ethnographies across countries. We've got survey data. I think there are pretty clear patterns, both sociodemographic patterns about voters who are predominantly outside of major urban centers, lower education, from the majority ethno-religious groups, and also about the centrality of ethno-nationalist beliefs among these voters. I would just put that out there.
Great. Yeah, and I think that it's a question, I mean, you've made this point that we live in a world of quick takes right now, and that the sort of immediate postmortems, that it actually just takes time for us to actually gather the data that allows us to speak to the current moment and the 2020 election, but that but these longer standing patterns are well known, and so it's a question of actually just giving people time for the data to actually kind of saturate.
And I think, even with that, I think there is some value in hearing people talk about why they do what they do, or sort of why they vote, right? So, right, I think Bart is absolutely right. We have a lot of evidence about who is voting for Trump and what sort of broad, ideological beliefs or political beliefs they might have. But I also think, I'm doing, I've started taking part in the American Voices Project. You should Google it. And it's been looking at interviews, right, with the sort of random sample of Americans, and reading those transcripts. It's really interesting to see how people construct the narratives of why they're doing what they're doing, right? How they talk about sort of the meaning of politics in their lives, or don't talk about it, right? And how not caring is sort of associated with certain kinds of political behavior. So I think, I guess I would say take a little bit from column A, Mabel, and column B, Bart, and just be like, right, we do know stuff, and we shouldn't walk around being like, we don't know what's going on. But I also think that there's still plenty to learn, right? And a lot of that is, is going to come from interviews, talking to people, but also quantitative data. I think there's been awesome experimental work that's looking at sort of political behavior and what people are willing to put up with, and how you can frame messaging to get them to act differently. So, it's sort of a all comers, I'd say, in terms of methodology to figure this out.
Yeah. And I think on that point, we have a question that ties into that, and it relates to one of your earlier points, Corey. Paul Lichterman says that you made a striking point that Republican Party identity means more to Republicans than Democratic Party identity means to Democrats.
Know any of this?
And he asks, what would be an alternative identity or super identity for Democrats or progressives or people who are interested in a democracy movement in the US that would be compelling enough to keep pro-democratic small d people actively engaged in defending and promoting democracy? And maybe you have some thoughts out of this project. In 2 minutes.
I feel like, yeah, no, right. If I had to answer to that, do you think I'd be on this Zoom? I would be getting paid up by the DNC. Yeah, I mean, I guess, look, I think my inclination might be towards sort of, articulating what lefty progressive politics can do for you kind of thing, which in some ways seems counterintuitive because it sort of like frames it around sort of self-interest, like your self-interest as a voter, or your sort of like self-interest as a member of some subgroup of democratic politics. But I don't think that, honestly, like, I'm not convinced that sort of an anti-Republican message is really the way to go, because I think actually, under the Democratic umbrella, there's a fair amount of sympathy with a lot of what the Republicans are saying, right? Like the aftermath of the election, as Bart was saying, the Democrats weren't like, we won, bitch. They were like, oh, maybe we shouldn't say defund the police. Maybe we shouldn't be pushing for racial justice, right? Which is just, the left's version of trying to control how Black people talk about their own existence, right? So, which all that is to say, like, I'm not convinced that sort of we're not the Republican Party is the way to go, because there's a lot that the Republican Party is that appeals to people who are in the Democratic coalition, right? So I think, something that sort of talks about, I don't know, sort of like a party that's working for you, but working for you in ways that don't just play to, your ethnic and racial biases, but maybe play to your material conditions, right? So I guess, I don't know, I'd be inclined to start thinking around how to talk about material conditions in a way that would resonate with people. And I think this gets back to this question of like, this is one of those things we need to know, right? And like good data would help on this, and not, I hope somebody is studying this somewhere. But yeah, so that's a non-answer that filled the time you allotted.
Good answer. Did anyone have any other thoughts on that? We have just a couple minutes left here, so.
I mean, I think there's a question of, if indeed my argument is right that part of the answer for the rise of radical right politics is the activation of nationalist cleavages, then there's the question of what to do about that. So I think there's the question of what do we do institutionally to protect American democracy in the immediate future, and I think we can talk about that. If we had more time, we'd talk about it. And then there's a question of electoral strategy, which I think was what Paul Lichterman was getting at. And there's this question of whether, some have argued that Democrats should come back with their own version of nationalism and fight the battle, right? The battle of different conceptions of America at the electoral booth. But I think that's dangerous, because this, once the battle becomes about nationalism, it's very difficult to avoid, kind of fanning the flames of racism and xenophobia and so forth on the right. The other option would be to change the topic, and I think this is partly what Corey was getting at. Change the topic to, economic justice and racial justice to some degree too, right? I mean, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, they're actually deeply intertwined, and away from nationalism as the main axis along which elections get decided. But that's obviously, easier said than done.
Great. And Mabel, did you have any sort of last thoughts you want to share?
Unfortunately, I've been zooming in and out, as it were. But basically, I didn't hear it. But basically, I mean, I think that basically all the points have been more or less on target. I think we have some new thinking to do. There's certainly been a lot. I didn't want to leave suggesting that I didn't know any of the other research that's been done, because there's certainly been a lot of research, as Bart was saying. But I was just suggesting that we need to sort of maybe open our minds a little to new ways of trying to get at this particular problem. And that's enough for my 1 minute.
Great. And I think this is especially pressing given we've gotten a number of questions about some of the changes that are actually underway right now, and particularly changes in the media landscape, the changes that are ongoing within the Republican Party, and some of the fights that are happening in terms of some people trying to redirect the, sort of where the Republican Party is going right now. Somebody asks, is it possible for that party to sort of change course in terms of its future? We have a question about sort of how a range of other political institutions have been engaging with nationalist ideas in different kinds of ways, and sort of, really being more granular in the way that we discuss how different institutions are handling these things. And so I think that all of this is to say is that there's a lot that we could talk about. And if there is interest in doing, further panels that get at some of these questions, I think that there's certainly more to discuss. So I just want to sort of honor our time here and thank our panelists for, really getting into a lot of depth in a short amount of time, and for helping us to think about this complicated moment in our country's history that is still ongoing and in process. And thanks to all of you. Thanks to the committee for organizing this. Thanks to all of our attendees and question askers. As Hannah just said in the chat, please stay tuned for our next panel in January, which will be on the culture of poverty, myth, and anti-Blackness in the 21st century. That's sure to be another excellent panel. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you.